present to the grandchildren, and because they really want to know about the Bowie family and their heritage. And I thought the best way to do that would be to go ahead and take a video cassette recording of it.
Well, I think it's a wonderful idea, except that I'm not a very good subject.
Well, you're a great subject.
I don't mean
You've got all
looking at. I mean, you know, if I were just, if you were asking me questions and all, I could answer them. But to pull stuff out of the.
Well, I am going to ask you questions.
All right.
I'm going to ask you all sorts of good questions. You know, like.
We'll start out.
Yeah, like. Tell us about your mother and your father. I don't even know where they were born, where they came from.
Oh, really?
No. And the girls don't either.
Well, I've given you so much material.
I know, but
and you've got the Bowie book, and you've got the.
But all they have are names, you know. But you know a lot about their life. You know, like grandfather was a meteorologist.
Yeah.
And I think he went to school in
St. John's Academy at Annapolis. He graduated there.
You see, that doesn't show up in any of those slips that we have.
Oh, yes, it does. In the books, it does.
Well,
maybe not.
I don't think so. See, that's the kind of information that they would be looking for. That's the kind of information.
And then he got an honorary degree from St. John's.
What for?
Just because of his
government service?
His not only the military service, but the service in the meteorological. He was world renowned as a meteorologist.
How did he happen to get into that?
As a weatherman.
Yeah, but how did he happen to pick that as a field, you know?
Well, he left home. He had trouble with his father. And there was great misunderstanding. And he left and went south. He didn't know where he was going. I don't know whether he knew where he was going to get a job, but he went to Montgomery, Alabama, and was taken into the Weather Bureau, got a job in the Weather Bureau. And the man that gave him his job was Uncle Wilfred, Uncle Wilfred Wilson, and he was the chief meteorologist down there, and he had married my mother's sister, Aunt Winnie, and they introduced my mother to my father down there.
Where was this?
What?
Where was this?
Montgomery, Alabama. And then she had come down from the farm in Illinois, Lighthouse, Illinois. This isn't taping, is it?
Oh, no, we're just doing a little practice right now.
Her father had come from the northeastern states. All the family came from New Hampshire and Vermont and Connecticut. And his health broke. He had married my grandmother out there. His health broke, and I don't know what he had, but he couldn't use his eyes. And they moved out to Illinois, and he bought this farm and began farming, and he had to finish his studies. He was studying to be a minister in the Methodist Church. And so my grandmother did all of the reading for him. She would sit there and read everything out of books to him. And he got his education, finished his education that way with grandmother's help. And then the children began, and then he started his own little church there, a little Methodist church. And he was the Methodist minister for that large area out there. And became a very prosperous farmer, as well as head of the church. And he had always told everybody never to leave the clothesline up in the yard after dark. And he was a heavy man, and he came in one night at dusk on his horse. He rode everywhere. He never walked, he rode. And he rode into the yard, and one of the family had failed to take the clothesline down, and it caught him at the chest line and dragged him backward onto the ground from the height of the horse. And after that he had pneumonia and died. It killed him. And so after that, that was after I was born. That was, he christened me in September 1898. And it was right after that that he was died, after he had his accident. So it was after my mother had married, you see,
right,
that happened.
And this was your mother's father?
My mother's father. His name was Alonzo Perry Hatch. And he married Clara Lavinia McKinstry, and my name is Helen McKinstry. And what should I tell you? Well, anyway, my father met my mother and fell in love with her down in Montgomery, Alabama. They married, and he was sent up to Memphis, Tennessee, and they went up there. And then from there he was sent up to Dubuque, Iowa, where I was born. And they were each, I think they were the same age. I think they were both born in 1874. I'm not sure about that. My father could have been a little older than that, a year older, but I'm not sure. And then from, you want to hear about my father?
Yeah, I like to.
And so, well, then after Dubuque, he was sent down. They had the Galveston flood. I think it was the worst flood that they'd ever had. And the present forecaster down there had failed to forecast correctly and warn Galveston of what could happen, and it was a hurricane. And so the people did not evacuate. And I think that storm was in 1902. The storm brought the water in from the ocean, and that didn't do the damage. The damage was caused when the wind stopped and they swept everything out to sea. People and houses and everything. It just cleaned the island off. And so it was, the man was discharged and was not kept in the service, I don't think. I'm not sure about that. But my father was sent down there to replace him. And he was very popular. Your grandfather was so much like you. I mean, he just attracted people. He had a certain magnetism about him, always. And so he did such a good job down there as a young forecaster. They sent him up to St. Louis in charge of the Weather Bureau in St. Louis. And my sister Margaret was born in St. Louis then. And from St. Louis, he really loved St. Louis. He knew all the businessmen and everybody, just like your father too. You know, it was just into everything. Just they called him the weather bird, and every day in the paper there would be a little picture of a little bird, one of these caricatures of a bird, and it was Bowie, Edward Bowie, the weather bird. And then he would give the forecast up there. And he made very strong friends there. So from St. Louis, he was sent to Washington, D.C. And that's where I was raised, right here. I started being raised, you see, in St. Louis. I started school there. And
Well, you also had part of the Hash family was down in 76, Missouri.
well, it was while he was in St. Louis that my uncle, Uncle George, would ask us up to his farm at 76, so that he was close. My mother felt close to him. It was sort of like a father figure. He was that much older than my mother, and she depended a great deal on him. And so then we came to Washington, D.C. And what should I tell you? What else should I tell you?
Well, where did you live in Washington?
They bought a house on 28th, 26th, 27th Street, right near the hotel down there where you stay often. Not the Shoreham, but the one, not,
Kennedy Warren? By that?
no, down near the Shoreham, but across the street from the Shoreham. All the way to Woodley Road.
Yeah, that's a Hilton now.
Well, but it's got another name. It's the Wardman building.
Wardman Park. Used to be the Wardman Park.
Yeah, it used to be Wardman Park.
And they lived in the Wardman Park?
No, that was undeveloped woods.
Oh, I see.
Just nothing but woodland. And then our street and Garfield Street and Cathedral Avenue were the few streets there, right across from the zoo, you see.
Mm-hmm. Is that house still there?
And the house is a row house there, yes. There was nothing built in front of us except this. We had this row house and we had everything to play in, just the whole countryside. And it was just a block off of Connecticut Avenue. And it was, then I went to the Eaton School. The Eaton School is one of the nicer schools down there. And it was right up Cathedral Avenue. About, I guess, I don't know how many blocks, 8 blocks in Cleveland Park. So that's where I went to school until I graduated from the 8th grade. I ought to tell them about the grandfather, about Louis.
Well, why don't you start with him?
Well, Louis was born, let's see, Louis' mother was Julia Watkins, and her father was Louis Watkins, for whom Louis was named, Louis Watkins Prentiss. And his wife died when her last baby was born, and so the family was raised by Aunt Em. Her name was Emily Evans, I think. And that was grandfather's sister. I think, or maybe it was a sister. It was a sister of grandmother's mother that raised them. She raised Aunt Alice, Aunt Catherine, and Aunt Lou, Uncle Sam, and and grandmother, who was Julia Watkins. And he worked in the post office, Louis Watkins. And I just gave Catherine a lot of duplicate, what do you call these, photographic copies of his death and his life and his service in the post office down there. He was quite elderly when he died, and they kept him on until he was nearly, maybe he was 80, before they retired him, which is something very unusual. And so when he died, and Catherine came to live with Mother Prentiss and Father Prentiss. I'm all mixed up. I mean, I'm just rambling. This is very hard for me.
Well, so we just.
Um,
I think it's, you know, I follow you completely.
well, Julia Watkins married William Clark Prentiss, and he was a patent attorney. And he did a lot of traveling for different companies. And one of them was situated out in the West, that mining interests. And every time he would go out there to do their work in the different areas, the mining areas, he'd come back with presents for his children. And your father was about 3 years old. And every time he'd come back, he'd bring him an Indian papoose doll. And the third time he brought a doll back to him, your father said, "I was tired of Indian babies."
And he used that expression
I
all
was
his life.
tired of Indian babies. Well, I thought that was so cute.
And he used that expression all his life.
Yeah.
Anytime he got
I
tired.
know it.
Anytime
I
he
was
got bored
tired
with
of
something.
Indian babies.
Anytime he got bored with something.
That expression of Jesus Christ, Miss Agnes.
Yeah.
I love to hear him say that, but it was very shocking.
And oh my, what a warm day.
Oh, you know what that came from?
Well, tell me about that.
You don't know that?
I think it's
I
a
have
record.
told you that,
I
haven't
think
I?
it's a record, as I think.
It was a record that they had, the grandfather Prentiss had in his library, and it was about a Philadelphia family. And they were talking about the summer. My, that was a warm day. And the perspiration from her drowned her poor little children in the parlor below. My, that was a warm day.
And he used to use that
Huh?
and he used to use that expression all the time.
My, that was a warm
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. And if somebody didn't know that story, they wouldn't understand what he's talking about.
No, absolutely not. You have to give it a little background. And then he was just about that same age, and he was having difficulty being housebroken, trained. And he came in one day, and there was a wet spot on the front of his trousers. And his mother said, "Oh, Louis." And he said, "Don't worry, it's just perspiration." I thought that was such a cute thing. Don't worry, it's just perspiration. Wasn't that cute? And he was such a cute looking little boy with a head full of white curls just all over and blue eyes. He was just beautiful. And
Where did they live?
Huh?
Where did they live? Where did they live?
They lived at 1720 Oregon Avenue, and it's still down there. And Oregon Avenue is now Swan Street. And it's being reclaimed. There were 3-story brick houses, row houses. And it was owned by by grandfather Prentiss's father. And he was a pharmacist, a doctor and a pharmacist. And he owned a drugstore in Washington, down near DuPont Circle. I think that's right. And one day he came home. His wife had died, and that's why Grandfather Prentiss and grandmother took the house and raised their children there, and kept the grandfather there to give him a home because he owned the place. And to go back a little bit, on this same property there was a little house on the property that your grandfather Prentiss took grandmother Prentiss when they were married, and they lived there until Margaret was born. Margaret was born in that little house. Then it was after that that the the mother-in-law died, so they moved into the big house to take care of the grandfather. So he came home one time and just said, I sold the business. And your grandfather, Prentiss, was so upset, terribly upset, just to think that he would just throw up the sponge and quit. But he did. He didn't want to do it anymore. And he was a very, very stubborn old man. And one time, Mother Prentiss had a cook, and she had a laundress, and then she had a little girl that helped them wait on the table. Well, on certain days they didn't work, which was a Thursday. So Mother Prentiss was getting the dinner, and she had baked potatoes. And I think she had a lot of difficulty with the old man, because he was getting irascible. And he came out in the kitchen and asked if he could help, I guess. And she said, the baked potatoes are in the oven, put them in a bowl and take them to the table. And I think he was there. There were just the three of them there that night. I think the children had gone. And he said he didn't need a bowl. So he took the potatoes and started for the dining room. And they got hotter and hotter, and he began juggling them. And he juggled the potatoes all the way in and threw them on the table. And Mother Prentiss thought that was so funny. He couldn't be told a thing. You tell him to do something, no, that isn't what he was going to do. So he had the hot potatoes in his hand, and he had to get to the dining room in a hurry.
Was Pop born at that address?
Huh?
Was Pop born at that address?
He was born in that house. Mm-hmm. He was the second child. I think Mother Prentiss had a couple of miscarriages around that time too, but she ended up having the three children, and Clark was just about a year and a half younger than Lou. And every time they would ask Clark if he could do something, he said, no, but my brother can. My brother can. They were just so cute together. She always dressed them in sailor suits with big boots, big black ties, these sailor collars, and they dressed alike. They were almost twins. And they both had curls, but Louis were tighter. I've got to go to the bathroom.